Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with MARIA KONNIKOVA presenting her new book, The Biggest Bluff, How I Learned to Pay Attention, Master Myself, and Win, joined in conversation by Joshua Foer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This event will have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase The Biggest Bluff on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series in our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And now, I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. MARIA KONNIKOVA is a best-selling author and journalist, a visiting fellow at NYU School of Journalism, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker. She's the author of the books The Confidence Game and Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. Her writing has been featured in the Best American Science and Nature Writing, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal, among others. And it has won a Robert P. Balls Prize in Critical Thinking and an Excellence in Science Journalism Award from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology, among many other awards. She's also the host of Panoply Media's podcast, The Grift, about con artists and their victims. Most recently, she's been a professional poker player, and from that experience wrote her latest book, The Biggest Bluff, which the Washington Post called a fascinating journey and narrative, which starts as a whim and is transformed in the process into a provocative and moving spiritual journey, one that will inspire readers as much as it entertains them. And the New York Times said that Konnikova keeps the lines so clean and even, so steady and unshowy, that she might be the Charlie Watts of prose. While the backbeat never ceases and the narrative propels along, it's her curiosity that proliferates. Tonight, MARIA will be joined by journalist and entrepreneur Joshua Foer, the co-founder of Atlas Obscura, the international design competition Sukkah City, and the Jewish digital library Safaria, and the best-selling author of Moonwalking with Einstein. We're so happy to have them both here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Josh and MARIA.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It feels like we are all together in one space, even though we're spread out. I'm actually just down the road from the Harvard Bookstore, the wonderful Harvard Bookstore in Brookline. And it's like just an absolute pleasure to be here with you, MARIA. Can I just start by asking you how the virtual book tour is treating you?
Absolutely. And first, before I answer, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for hosting us. And thank you, Josh, for doing this, especially because, you know, the way the virtual book tour is treating me, I think all of us are so zoomed out by this point where we've been doing virtual events for the last year and a half that it's such an honor when someone will still take the time to appear in a little virtual box next to me. So thank you. It's definitely not the same. It's wonderful to be able to do it and then to be able to get together with people from all over the world in a way that you can't if you're doing a physical event. But I do miss seeing people in person and the intimacy and energy that comes from being able to do a book launch in person. And of course, even when The Biggest Bluff just came out in hardcover, that was also already virtual. So this particular book has never seen a real life audience.
So let me just ask you about that, because one of the pleasures of doing a paperback tour is that you're no longer out like promoting a book that nobody has read. Now it's been a thing in the world for a year. It's, you know, people have read it, I'm sure, giving you feedback. I'm curious, what is the most surprising or unexpected response that you have gotten from somebody who's read the book?
I have been really surprised by the number of people from different walks of life who found that it speaks to them. So I expected, the poker community, and also, there are obviously parallels with investing and finance. And I expected a lot of that, but I've had, surgeons say, this is the book that we needed about, decision-making and risk-taking and all of these things. You should rewrite it, but this time do medicine. and I, every time I get one of those notes, it's very nice, but I also need to respond and say, no, I'm not rewriting this book with a focus on do medicine next, or, do carpentry next. And I've gotten both of those requests.
What do you think is the analogy that the surgeon sees, or what are they taking away from this? That, like, what about poker speaks to them?
I think it's the fact that you constantly have to make high pressure decisions with incomplete information, and you do your best, and you have to learn to evaluate risks, and you have to learn to deal with uncertainties and decide and act, even with knowing that you don't have the whole landscape, and that the outcome is always probabilistic. Every surgery might go wrong, and that doesn't mean that you don't do the surgery. It means you have to learn how to make that risk assessment, how to think through it, how to stay in control of your emotions, how to actually implement that rational decision-making calculus. What variables do you use? What's your process like? So I think that a lot of the things that I described as I learned to play poker are applicable there in terms of those types of calculations and evaluations. At least I think so. I'm not a surgeon.
Right. Yet, but there is always the next book. I actually want to ask you about your journey, not the journey of becoming a world-class poker player, which is the story of the book, but the journey before that journey to becoming the person who would take on a project like this. Like, can you tell us that story?
Why don't you tell me the story now? It's a really hard question, because it's kind of an origin story. What makes us who we are, what makes us take the risks we do and make the decisions we do. And I think that I was actually set on that path, not to get all Freudian, but I think if we go back to kind of my early childhood, I was born in the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. Berlin Wall hadn't fallen, still an Iron Curtain. No one knew what was going to happen. And my parents decided to leave and to come to the United States and to get asylum here. And that, if you think about it from my perspective, I had nothing to do with that decision. It was all luck for me. It was all just things happening to me. And I was scared. I was nervous. I remember that feeling so well, of just being scared of the unknown and realizing I don't speak the language. No one understands me. I don't understand anyone. It's really scary. But now imagine what it must have been like for my parents. It's terrifying. You're going to a world that you know nothing about. There's no internet, there's no media. You want to get out of where you are. And, talk about role model in terms of being willing to take these huge life risks that have the potential for insane rewards, but that are also scary as hell, because you're taking this just giant leap of faith with your whole life. And I think that subconsciously that must have really had an impact on how I think and how I kind of evaluate decisions, because I'm not someone who's a risk taker in my day-to-day life. I'm petrified of motorcycles, never gone skydiving. I do not want to take any extra risks when it comes to my own well-being. But I'm also capable of making kind of really big decisions that are quite risky. I actually had, I think, 6 jobs my first year out of college, and quit the first one, within a week with nothing to fall back on, because I was miserable and I was confident enough that I'd be able to do something else, that I took that risk. And that's a huge risk. I had no safety net or anything. Also, I was probably young and stupid, but that's another part of that. And I've done kind of things like that in my past. So for me, there's a part of me that has that kind of risk calculus where if it's scary but worth it, then I'll do it. If I think that I might get something out of it. And with the poker journey, I mean, it was a leap into complete unknown territory because I knew nothing about poker. I knew nothing about that world at all. I didn't know if I'd be good. I didn't know if I'd be successful. I didn't know what it would look like. And in some ways it didn't matter, right? I would have written a book no matter what. It's a different book and I think a better book because I ended up, being able to have a victory there. You know how that feels. And, the book is very different if you come in second place when it comes to your big championship moment than if you win. There's that huge difference, and that's not something you can plan for. But it was a big leap of faith, and initially it came from, what I write about in the book. It came from a period in my life where things weren't going well, and a lot of unlucky things had happened to me. I was sick. My grandmother had died in an accident. My husband had lost his job. My mom had lost her job. A lot of things were just happening that I think primed me to take a risk like that and to explore it from a very personal standpoint, to explore that world of the unknown and of uncertainty. And in another kind of meta sense, I've always been an explorer. As a journalist, I'm always someone who loves going down different rabbit holes and learning about new worlds. And so I think that there was a part of my mind, of the journalistic mind, that was also engaged to see what would happen from an outside objective perspective.
How would you describe yourself as a journalist?
It's funny that you ask that, because how I describe myself has changed a lot since The Biggest Bluff, because it was actually the first person piece of journalism I've ever done. I came up in a very, you should not be part of your own story type of training and tradition. And I'd been at the New Yorker for a while before going on leave to write The Biggest Bluff, and you basically have the first person voice drummed out of you. You need to sound like the New Yorker, and you need to take back your personality in a way. And you really can't be a character. Of course, there's a personal essay section, but not the journalism. In the journalism, I should really not appear. And so I would have, in the past, I was someone who just was a fly on the wall and who would dive into different lives and different careers and different questions that interested me and observe them and report on that from kind of this outside perspective. And then The Biggest Bluff was a total departure, because all of a sudden it was first person narrative, it was memoir, I was the main character, and it was my voice. And when I was working on it, I don't know how you write, Josh, but I don't show drafts to people when I'm working at all. So until I'm done with the first draft, no one sees it. So I don't kind of have people with whom I bat back and forth. It's all just me. And so I had this moment before I hit send on this manuscript to my editor of just pure terror, of not knowing, does this work? Does my voice work? Are people going to like my voice? Are they going to hear, are they going to like what I sound like? Or do I sound terrible? Am I going to sound annoying on the page? How does the tone work? Does this all come together? I had no idea. I had no way of evaluating it, because that's not the type of journalism I'd ever done. And those days before my editor sent back, the initial round of comments were harrowing. Luckily, he's a fast reader, so it didn't take long. But I was just on pins and needles for that entire time.
When you started out reporting this story or getting involved in this world of poker, did you know that it was going to be first person, or did that only become apparent at a certain point in the journey?
It only became apparent at a certain point in the journey. I knew it was going to be first person to an extent, because I was always going to be taking people on this journey, but I didn't realize how memoiristic it was going to be. And I didn't realize how much of a protagonist I was going to be until partway through it. So yeah, it definitely changed from how I envisioned it. I'm actually curious, can I throw that back at you? What about Moonwalking with Einstein? Because it's also this, very personal journey. Was that what it was supposed to be from the get-go?
No, actually. I also, like you, don't like writing about myself and don't like being the center of the story. And I thought I was going to write something about like all these, funny, strange people who compete in competitive memory championships. And it was only after I won the contest that I was like, oh shit, there's no way to write this story without being the center of it. And for me, that was actually really a hard thing to accept. I mean, it only took a second for me to realize, oh, this is going to be a much better book, but like, it was not the one that I initially had wanted to write. I'll tell you, I recently read a book by Tom Vanderbilt, relatively new book, called Beginners, which is about the joy of taking on a vast new subject as a total novice. And I think there's some journalists who don't approach the world that way. Like their job is to become the master of a beat and know everything there is to know about subject X so that they can write definitively about it. But that's not really the kind of journalist you are, is it?
No.
Tell us more about that. Like, where do you find your stories?
In the world. That's the true answer. Like, I find my stories in things that all of a sudden intrigue me and interest me in the course of living. I mean, my first piece that was accepted to the New Yorker, I had submitted for many years unsuccessfully, was of all things about yawning, about why we yawn and why you sometimes catch people's yawns and sometimes don't. It's not like all yawns are equally contagious. And I was just thinking about this at some point, I think at a dinner party observing people, and I found it fascinating and I started thinking about it and it became a big story where I actually, got to meet all these researchers who study yawning from different perspectives and all these different theories, one that has to do with temperature and physiology. And I got into animal behavior and whether different breeds have contagious yawning. And I just got into this whole new world. And because it interested me, even though I had no interest in it beforehand, it was just a sudden question, it became an interesting story. And I've realized that, any subject can be fascinating if the person writing is interested in it. I think Michael Lewis is such a great example of that because I don't care about baseball at all. I think it's very, very boring. And yet I can read Michael Lewis on baseball. I'm like, whoa, this is so cool. This is totally fascinating. And so I suddenly become interested in a topic I have no interest in. But my stories, I constantly am writing down ideas and writing down things I find interesting. And I have a file on my computer where I dump different articles and references and I screenshot stuff that I find interesting along the way. And I never know how I'm going to use it or when I'm going to use it or if I'm going to use it. But I have, one Word file that's at this point, I don't know how many pages long, definitely over 100, with just completely disorganized me writing ideas, and a notes file on my phone where I do the same thing, and then this file of articles. And if something captures my mind for some reason, the important thing is to then capture it. And the one thing I do know from my work in psychology, and that from your journey, is that memory can be a very fickle friend. So never think you're going to remember this great idea if you don't actually make a conscious effort to remember it, to capture it. So there have been so many times where I'm like, oh my God, this is brilliant, I'm never going to forget it. And then the next day I'm like, wait, what was that brilliant insight that I had? So I try to write them down in a very disorganized fashion. I'm not an organized person at all, unfortunately, but that's where the ideas are. And then they kind of cross-pollinate and they grow and they become these new things that I didn't realize were there. And then I start seeing connections and all of a sudden I have a story.
Do you remember what the impetus was for this book? Was there, because you really had no experience with poker.
No, and when I decided I wanted to write about luck, and kind of just the role that luck plays in our
did
lives.
it start with luck and then,
Yes.
and okay, interesting.
Started with luck, and I went through 6 months of just not being able to find a story for luck, because luck is, as you know, it's not a book. Just like if you were to say, I want to write a book about memory. Okay, it's a big topic. What are you going to say about it? What's the story? And so I just went through so many different ideas that my agent would just say, no, no, no. And it would get very frustrating because I was like, oh, why won't this work? I had this great idea where I was going to go through the Ellis Island records of everyone who arrived on one ship on one day and find, a few people with very different lives and kind of trace the element of luck from that point on. Et cetera, et cetera. I was reaching for some of these, but I still think that could be a cool idea. Anyway,
that is a cool idea.
So I was just reading a lot and having these ideas cross-pollinate. And the immediate impetus for me starting to learn something about poker was actually reading John von Neumann, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And I didn't read the whole book because it's very hard, and I'm not mathematically minded, and it was tough for me. But there were some really cool parts of it that I did read, and I learned that von Neumann was a poker player, and that game theory actually was born from poker. That there was this game, and this just brilliant mathematician of the 20th century who created so much of the modern world. I mean, father of the computer. Father of game theory, that poker was the inspiration for game theory, and that he believed that this game was kind of the perfect model for looking at life. And he explained it very neatly that, real life isn't chess. Chess is a game with answers. It's a game of complete information. You see the board, you see all the pieces, and with enough computing power, you can figure out what the right move is because everything's there. You have just the full data set. And he said, that's not life. Life is not chess. And he has this wonderful quote that I'm going to, I hope not misquote, maybe I'll try to approximate it as closely as I can. He has this wonderful sentence: real life consists of bluffing, of little tactics of deception, of trying to figure out, what does this man think I mean to do? And that's what games are about in my theory. And to me, that one sentence, well, 2 sentences, was just so intriguing because, as someone who comes from a psychology background, it's so cool to see a mathematician say, well, real life isn't just math. It's people and it's dynamics. And it's not just what I think and what you think, it's what I think you think and what you think I think, and all of these, back and forth processes. And that just intrigued me to the point where I thought, let me Google what this poker thing is. So I literally just, then went on a search to figure out, okay, what's poker, literally, because the only poker game I'd ever seen was in the movie Rounders. So my impression of poker was Teddy KGB, sitting at the table saying, bait the man, he's money. And that was poker in my world.
So having done all this thinking about luck, I'm curious how it has changed your outlook on life.
I have become much more of a, I think, Zen person because I've realized how much of our life is luck, and how big of a force it is just in almost everything. And, as I write, and as I've said before, it's necessary to work hard, right? That's crucially important. You can't just sit back and say, all right, universe, do your thing. But it's not sufficient ever. You also have to get lucky. And those 2 things, for successful people, those 2 things come together. And if I had to say, was one more important than the other, I'd say probably luck. if you actually define luck as also the accident of birth, and where were you born, and to whom you were born, and what your genes are like, and what your family is like, all those things that you can bear no credit for. I mean, none of that is your skill. That's just genetic lottery. That's just kind of the chance of who you are. And so if you start thinking about it that way, you do realize that luck is just a huge factor in success, a huge factor in how our lives go. That said, poker makes you appreciate how important it is to play well, and how important it is to use any situation and try to find a skill advantage, even when you're quote unquote unlucky. Because the best poker players can take shitty cards and shitty situations and still win, and still end up being triumphant because they're a more skilled player. And that's inspiring, and that's really cool. That means that, you can learn to, through mindset, through skill, through kind of your approach, you can actually really maximize even those moments when you are quote unquote unlucky.
So if you were going to distill like the lessons that you learned in the process of becoming this expert poker player into, I'll give you 3 key ideas, what would they be?
3 key ideas. Let's see. 1, everything is both luck and skill. So skill can only get you so far. But in the long term, I think this is very important. In the long term, skill does end up mattering more than luck, in terms of, your outcomes. That if you can make it long enough, the only cure for variance and kind of for the noise of the universe is time, and is kind of playing enough hands, whether actual reality hands or metaphorical hands of life. Another, I think, crucial lesson is not to conflate the outcome of a decision with the process. So a lot of times we take the outcome and we say, oh, good outcome, good decision, bad outcome, bad decision. That's not true. And that's a mistake that we make so often in life, that, we end up deriving the wrong lessons for ourselves and judging people incorrectly, both positively and negatively, thinking some people are more talented than they are, and thinking some people are less talented than they are based on an outcome that they've had, where in reality, what poker teaches you over and over and over is that you can make a good decision. You can be a statistical favorite and still lose. And that doesn't mean that you should make a different decision next time. That doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It just means that in this particular time, you got unlucky, which I think leads me to the 3rd most important lesson, which is focus on the things you can control. Focus on the things you can actually change. The outcome isn't one of them. You don't control the cards. You don't control what happens after you make the decision. And so why in the world should you spend your time, your energy? Those resources are precious and they're finite. Why spend them just dwelling on outcomes, on things that you can't do anything about? I think you'd be much better served trying to figure out, okay, what can I do? What is actually within me to control? My decision process, my emotions, my actions, my reactions, which is really important. Actually, your reactions are a big thing in terms of your mental fortitude and your mental game, which is huge, both in poker and in life. But just focusing on that and trying to devote all of your energy on that, and worrying less about what happens and what the result is. I think it's an important lesson, but it's a really hard lesson. It's really hard to let go of outcome.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the concealment of one's own emotions in poker, and how you overcome your opponent's efforts to conceal their own emotions? And like, just that, that I think, tell people who don't know about poker, is like the thing that is most exciting and different about poker, is that it's this idea that it's all about like, what am I concealing? What are they concealing? And how are they showing the thing that they think they're concealing?
Yeah. So one of the things that you learn very early on in poker, and if you don't learn it, you're in trouble, is that there's a huge difference between how someone is acting and how strong they actually are, right? How confident someone is acting, how aggressive they're acting, and how calm they're acting, or how nervous they're acting, and how small they look, and how timid they look. And if you always take that as a sign of, oh, they have great cards, oh, they have bad cards, oh, they're strong or they're weak, you're not going to do very well. Because as you say, concealment and kind of control of the way that you present yourself is a huge part of how you play poker, because you realize at some point that nobody sees your cards. Nobody knows what you have except for you. All they know is how you present yourself. All they know is what you're showing. And if you're able to tell a convincing story emotionally and physically and in how you present yourself about how strong you are and how superior you are, if you do it well enough, then even good players will believe you in the right situations. And if you end up letting what you actually have dictate how you're acting, and if you end up letting outside circumstances dictate how you're acting, in poker, that's a concept known as tilt. So you're letting emotions into your decision process. So if you're tilting, then that's when you start making mistakes. That's when you actually start letting your emotions out in a way that's not controlled. That's when you start letting anger or frustration or whatever it might be, but anger and frustration tend to be two big ones at the poker table. That's when you start letting them govern your risk assessments and your decisions of how you're going to play. And that's when you start making really, really costly errors. And your goal is to actually not to stop experiencing emotion. I think a lot of people think, oh, to be good at poker, like the best players, they're like robots. They're just totally stone-faced, poker-faced, right? And their bodies are poker-faced. And they just don't experience what I experience. They don't care. That's not true. I actually think that it's the wrong goal to say, I shouldn't feel emotion about this. You're human. You're going to feel emotion. And you know what? As much as I talk about being Zen and letting go of outcome, when you lose, it sucks. And when you lose a lot of money, it really sucks. And it's frustrating and it makes you angry. And so the goal isn't to stop experiencing that. It's to learn to know yourself well enough that you recognize it, that you're able to identify the emotion that you're feeling, and that you're then able to dismiss it. And you dismiss it as irrelevant to the decision. And you say, hey, anger, hey, sadness, hey, fear, hey, frustration, I see you. Go away now and let me focus on this decision at this particular moment. And I feel like that's what most people need help with when it comes to emotional control, because most people are really good at having poker faces, even if you don't play a lot of poker, just because we have a lot of practice at it. I mean, if you think about how often you actually do conceal your emotions in day-to-day life, you'd be surprised.
100% of the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, well, at least for some of us.
No, but that's exactly right. When you meet people, we're out of practice now with COVID and everything, but you conceal it all the time. So we're pretty good.
But what about tells, right? I mean, isn't that's also part of the mythology of poker, is that people can't conceal it. And so tell us about how you conceal your tells and how you pick up on your opponent's tells.
Yeah, so I learned some really interesting stuff when I dove into kind of the science of tells and what we know about it. And it turns out that most tells are actually not in the face. They're in other parts of the body. And if I could take one body part and say, this is where most of the tells are, it's this one, your hands. So it turns out that people give off most information in their hands. And that's true for a few reasons. First of all, as I just said, we're pretty good at controlling our faces. We're used to it. We pay attention to them. We know we're supposed to have a poker face. No one tells us about poker hands. No one says, control your hands and control what your hands are doing. So we're not as conscious of them. We're not as conscious of what they're doing. We're not as conscious of the gestures that we're making. And then of course, you have your pulse right here. It's easy to see. Skin conductance when you sweat, that's on your hands. But I think the most important thing is that it's often outside of our conscious control. And so it turns out when you look at studies of what's actually predictive of whether someone is bluffing or not, there is some really, really cool work that looks at videos of poker players, and some of the footage you can see everything, from the waist up, the way that someone's sitting at a table. Some you can just see the face, and some you can just see the hands and the arms. And it turns out that if people don't know anything about poker, or if they do, it doesn't really matter. And you just ask, how strong is this person? How strong is their hand? They're able to predict that at much better than chance levels just by looking at the hands. If you look at the whole body, it's about 50-50. And if you look at the face, you actually become worse. So it turns out that we often read the wrong things into the face because we're looking at facial structure. We're looking at things like, oh, this person looks trustworthy, things that don't actually matter. But the hands end up leaking information. And I've actually found that to be very true, because the way that people do things with their hands all the time, they handle chips, they handle cards. It's true not just in poker. There's also some really cool work done in sports where, you can look at rugby players, and people who know nothing about rugby can actually predict the direction of a pass based on hand language beforehand, which is really cool. And when you're looking at people playing Legos, you can predict who's going to cooperate and who's going to not cooperate based on hands. And I don't think we can consciously say why we know. Maybe it's fluidity of gesture, maybe it's speed, who knows? And I think that you actually probably can train people to pay attention to certain things once you break it down. But even if you don't have conscious access to why the hands are still giving off signals. And we're very good at observing subtle signs when we know where to look.
So do you feel like you are have gotten better at controlling your hands and keeping them under your conscious control?
Yes, and I actually worked with an expert in tells who kind of studies footage of players all the time and does an analysis of this and has tons of thousands of data points on every person. And he analyzed footage of me playing and gave me some advice about kind of the most obvious things I was doing and how to standardize my behavior. That said, it's still hard, and it gets harder the more tired I am. So that's the other thing about poker is, you're playing for a very long time and you get exhausted. If you're playing tournaments, you've been there since noon and now it's 11 at night and you're still playing and you're tired and you want to go home and you want to go to sleep and you're hungry and you're stressed and all of these things are happening, and you still have to control your hands and make sure that you're acting in the same systematic way. And he actually found, because there's a lot of footage of me online playing, that as I get more tired, I do start leaking more, so to speak. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, our resources are finite.
How transferable is that particular skill, both the reading and the concealing, to other aspects of life? And are there other elements of being a great poker player that are transferable to other domains of life?
For sure. I mean, I think all of it is transferable if you have the right attitude. And I say that because there are some really great poker players who are really crappy at life because they just have never taken the time to take a step back and develop any sort of metacognitive awareness of what they're doing. And so they make great decisions in poker and really bad decisions outside of the poker table. That said, if you have the mindset of, okay, what are the skills I'm using here? How can I break them down? Then it becomes just eminently transferable. And with someone like Eric Seidel, who was my mentor in the poker world, I mean, he definitely uses all of his poker skills in every element of his life. And I think a lot of the best players are like that, because he does have self-awareness. That's the key. You need to have self-awareness and this critical desire to assess and to learn and to make the effort to take it and apply it elsewhere. It won't just happen naturally for most domains. It will happen naturally with some things. Like, I do think that poker players who play all the time and are serious about it and understand poker will become much better at making probabilistic decisions in real life, just because that's just a skill that you're using all the time, and you don't have to consciously think of the transfer. It's a direct transfer. Probabilistic thinking is the same, whether it's in poker or somewhere else. But other things like emotional control, like your ability to kind of have that strong mental approach, things like self-control, things like breaking down decisions and bankroll management, and kind of the nitty-gritty of what it takes to be a good bankroll player. I think it's incredibly relevant everywhere else, but I do think you need to make a conscious effort to transfer it, and to realize that, hey, if it serves me well to not explode at a poker table, maybe I'd be better served to use some of those same strategies when I'm having an argument with my spouse. Maybe I should do the same. Let's take a step back and calm down and have some space and try to take the emotions out of it to try to make a rational decision. And I do think that I've gotten much better at doing things like that through playing poker. But it does take conscious effort.
How much poker are you playing these days? And what is it like to now play poker as this celebrated journalist who's not only achieved so much in the sport, but also written about the game? And I just called it a sport. Is poker a sport?
It is. I definitely think poker is a sport. And I think a lot of people would agree. I mean, the person I ended up working with as my mental coach, Jared Tendler, he's a mental coach to athletes, and he started out was just athletes, originally golfers, and some other professional athletes, but then he went to poker and to esports because those are kind of natural continuations. So yes, I do think it's a sport. So for the last year and a half, I'd played zero poker, basically. I'd played a little online, but I like live poker so much more. And with COVID, there was just no live poker. And even when there was, I certainly did not feel comfortable playing poker. What I would tell people who are like, oh, you're being silly. So do you realize that the way that epidemiologists study the spread of infectious disease is by using poker? Literally, that's the study setup, because you're sitting next to each other for long periods of time, you're touching the same cards, you're touching the same chips. So they actually, they have those radioactive dyes and all of that. They use poker literally to look at how disease spreads. So no, I'm not playing any poker. But now, so as of 2 weeks ago, I came to Vegas to work on a new story, a new project that I'm working on right now. And I'm fully vaccinated. And so I'm starting to dip my feet back into the world of tournament poker. And it's been fun. I had to shake the rust off a little bit because it's definitely one of those things where if you haven't been living and breathing poker for a while, some cobwebs develop. But it's fascinating to go from not seeing anyone but my immediate family for a year and a half to all of a sudden, being in a casino and playing this game that I avoided like the plague, for the last year and a half. And poker is alive and well. There are so many people who've just clearly been anxious to get out there that it's actually, Vegas is going insane right now. Vegas, I think, thinks that the pandemic is long over.
Well, I want to make sure that we have time for people who are here virtually with us to ask questions. And so I think they're going to be able to drop their questions into the Q&A. And while folks are thinking about their questions, I want to end with because we're at a virtual bookstore with a book recommendation. So first of all, of course, we're recommending The Biggest Bluff, but what are you reading, or what have you read recently that I should read, that folks who are here should read? What are you enjoying?
Well, the last book I read was the new Kazuo Ishiguro book, Claire and the Sun. I don't know if you've read that. That's fiction, but I recommend it. I think it's lovely. And right now I'm actually reading more fiction. I'm reading the new Edward St. Aubyn novel, which is called Double Blind. And I'm really enjoying it so far. For people who are science-minded, this is actually, I think it's a great novel because he really immersed himself in the world of experimental science in order to write this. And the main characters, there's a neuroscientist, there are people doing really cool work as the main characters in the book. So that's what I've been reading. For those of you who somehow have been under a rock and have not read Moonwalking with Einstein, you really, really should. No, it's true. It came out a while ago, but it was a book that really affected me when I read it because it's unlike a lot of nonfiction in that, it's as captivating as a novel. And it's still, I actually reread it about 2 years ago, just when I was kind of getting into this project, just to kind of see, how did you do it? and it's still, a masterclass in how to write a great book of narrative nonfiction. So for those of you who have not read it, please do. I think it's one of my favorite nonfiction books to this day.
No, you're very kind. Thank you. I've got some questions here from the audience. Peter asks, do you play cash games at all? And do you believe that there is a different mentality, attitude between tournament players and cash players? And then I'm going to ask you to just clarify what that means for those of us who are poker outsiders.
For sure. So when most people think of poker, they actually think of cash. So that means that you buy in for a certain amount of money. Say I buy in for $1,000 and I get $1,000 worth of chips. And so if I gain more chips, that's actually dollars. And I can win those pots and I can get up at any point I want and take that money and cash out and leave. So at a cash game, I can play for as little or as long as I want to. Some people go in and out half an hour, others have marathon multi-day sessions playing cash games. In tournaments, your poker chips actually are worth zero. They have no monetary value. So say you buy in for that same $1,000. Every single person gets the exact same number of chips. And your chips are only worth something as it relates to the other players. So your goal is get all the chips. At the end of the day, there's going to be one person left with all of the chips. And crucially, you can't get up and leave. It's not like you can decide, I'll play a tournament for half an hour and then, take my chips and cash out, because no cash value. It's a long grind no matter what. And so you are there until you are not, until you bust, until you have no chips left. And in a cash game, a lot of people can be winners because people come and go, you can sit there and you can end up cashing out more than you cashed in. In a tournament, anywhere from 85 to 90% of the field is going to go home with zero. You will have spent whatever you spend to enter the tournament, and then you're going to bust before anyone cashes. And the money is concentrated at the top. So you're really only making a profit if you finish in the top 10, top 20, like real top of the tournament. And so that's kind of that's the main difference. And because of that, I think that the mental game is totally different when it comes to cash and tournaments. I do play both. I vastly prefer tournaments because and I chose to write about tournaments in my book because in terms of decision-making, dynamics, life metaphors, life is much more like a poker tournament because there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And the strategy differs depending on where you are in your life journey, where you are in your tournament journey. You have to think about things differently when you have, shorter stack, when you have more chips. You have to learn all of these different strategies at different times. You have to learn when to be aggressive, when to not be aggressive. And a cash game, first of all, the fact that you can leave at any given point in time is mentally completely different, right? If I know that I can just dip in and out, then it's a very different game than one where I know that I'm committed for multiple days if I do well. And the other thing is, if I know that if I'm not doing well, if I'm not feeling it, I can leave. If I know that if I'm doing really well and I'm done, I can leave. Mentally, that's very different. And you also have the option of always playing deep stacked. You can always play with lots of big blinds and just master one kind of strategy, and it doesn't change. The blinds aren't suddenly going to go up. The antes aren't suddenly going to go up. You don't have to adjust. You actually can just play the same strategy for the entire time. And it's much less variance, so you can make more money, I think, if you are a good cash player, steadily, in a more easygoing way. But in my mind, it's a lot less fun.
A question here. Anonymous attendee asks, I have some questions for Maria. What time in the grad school did you start to consider leaving academia? And how did you handle the transition and deal with the mental stress?
So I am the case of someone who was very lucky to even get into grad school, because I knew I was not going into academia from before I applied. Like, I never had any intention of going into academia. The only reason I went to grad school was following my curiosity. I loved psychology and I wanted to learn more about the mind and how we think and what makes us who we are. And I wanted to work with Walter Mischel, who became my graduate advisor, who's the marshmallow guy for people who don't know who Walter Mischel is. The famous marshmallow study. Can a little kid wait to get a second marshmallow, or is the kid going to eat that marshmallow right away? And this is not a strategy that usually works, because normally academia really frowns upon people who don't want to go into academia. But I actually told Walter flat out when we first met that I didn't want to go into academia, that I wanted to be a writer, but that I was fascinated by him and his work and I wanted to learn from him. And I got him at the right moment of his career. I mean, he was done. He was in his late 70s. He thought he'd taken his last grad student several years earlier. He was going to retire. And he thought he was okay with it. He was open-minded. He thought it was amazing that I wanted to do other things. And that's the kind of man he was. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, but he was someone, he himself was an artist. He had, some art shows of his own. He was one of the few academics of the old school who was just a lover of life and of knowledge and of learning, just a wise, wise man. And he agreed to take me on. And even still, I was almost unable to finish my PhD because I actually left partway through the program, went on an approved leave of absence to write my first book, Mastermind. And when I was coming back, there were a number of faculty who tried to block me from coming back with the argument that I wasn't going to be using my PhD, so they shouldn't be using department funds on me. Luckily, Walter was my advisor, so everything went well and I was allowed back. But that just goes to show that it's a really dangerous game to play, and that academia really is closed-minded and really does not look favorably on people who want to have outside interests. And it's funny how many students, after my book came out, and I was very open about the fact that I was going to be writing full-time after I got my PhD, would reach out to me and say, please don't tell anyone, but I'm also interested in doing something outside of academia. Will you talk to me? And I was always happy to meet, but they always wanted to meet off campus, far from Columbia, basically make sure that no one saw them talking to me. And that's kind of heartbreaking, because I think that you want to encourage curiosity in your students. You don't want to encourage them to, hide and lie and feel like they can't pursue something else, because that's not what you want.
Daniel, aka Batman 333, aka the Tesla guy, says, hello, I sent you a tweet a few days ago thanking you for sharing your story. Do you still aspire to earn more accolades in the WSOP, or do you feel that journey has been fulfilled? If so, is Eric Seidel still your Yoda? Looking forward to the next chapter in your poker journey, and was completely inspired in my decision-making. Living in the world of the pandemic, I think that there are more stories to tell, like The Biggest Bluff.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you, Daniel, AKA Tesla Guy. And yeah, I mean, I still see myself playing poker. We'll see. While I still enjoy it and feel like I'm learning and am competitive at it, I don't see why I can't play and write. The two things are perfectly compatible in my world. And would it be nice to get some WSOP accolades? Absolutely. And is Eric still my Yoda? Always and forever. He's the Yoda. He's such a brilliant man, and I'm very lucky to have him in my life.
We're going to see if we can squeeze in two last questions before 8 o'clock from Fabio. Between the original idea and the final draft, do you put together and follow a general plan, or do you follow ideas as they emerge during the research process?
This is one of those questions I dread because I don't want anyone to write the way I write, which is just a completely disorganized mess. No, I have no outlines. No, I do not follow a plan. My writing can best be described as vomiting on a screen and then kind of cleaning it up and trying to figure out what goes where. I write out of order. I don't write start to finish. I have no idea what's going to happen. And I've never been able to be organized no matter what I've done. And I also write to deadline, which is a horrible, horrible thing to do. So I might have 3 years to work on something and then I cram it all into the last month.
Sounds exactly like me, except that I write past deadline.
Oh, there you go.
All right, last question from an anonymous attendee. What do you think is one of the takeaways from your experience for an average person? Like, did you learn anything that will help me negotiate my salary or win an argument or even win a family board game night?
Yes, absolutely. In terms of negotiation, position is king or queen. So one of the things that you learn in poker is the importance of playing your hand in position, which means having the informational advantage because you're acting last. So one of the crucial things I can tell you that has worked really well for me to take from poker into the world of negotiation is try to give off as little information yourself and try to elicit as much information as possible from your opponent. So try to make sure they act before you. If they ask you for what your salary requirements are, say, I'd love to hear what you think is appropriate and we'll see if we can meet. Have them throw out the first numbers, have them be the ones to put that out there and then take it from there. Don't be the one who gives information first because then they have the advantage.
We can all take that to the bank. That was great advice. Thank you so much for joining us and for everybody for being here. Maria, you've written a great book and may it be read by many, many people. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for hosting us. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And I don't have either The Biggest Bluff or Moonwalking with Einstein, but let me once again pitch Moonwalking as the other book you should absolutely buy.
Agreed. And thank you both once again. Thanks to Maria and Josh. Thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about both books mentioned at harvard.com. That's The Biggest Bluff and Moonwalking with Einstein. And so on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, everybody have a good night, keep reading, and please, everyone, stay well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night.